My name is Amira Stone. I'm 28 years old, and 15 years ago, my own parents threw me out of their house when I was just 13. Last week, they walked into the reading of my uncle's will with confident smiles, dressed like people who believed they were about to become very rich. They even brought a private attorney with them, certain they would walk out with a fortune. The man whose will was being read was Uncle Victor Stone, the person who had raised me for the past 15 years. The man who stepped in the night my parents decided I was no longer worth keeping. But the moment attorney Elaine Carter opened that sealed envelope and began reading his final wishes, something shifted in the room. The confidence drained from their faces. And when she reached Clause 7, my mother, the woman who once told me I was no longer her daughter, suddenly jumped to her feet. Her face turned pale. Her mouth literally hung open. It looked like the ground had disappeared beneath her. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly touches your heart. I'm also curious, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment and let me know. To understand why my mother reacted that way, we have to go back 15 years. Back to the summer of 2010. Back to when I was a 13-year-old girl who honestly believed I was the reason everything in my family went wrong. I grew up in a modest house in southeast Portland. Nothing fancy, just a narrow 2-story home with peeling white paint and a yard that never quite grew grass evenly. But what I learned early in that house had nothing to do with money. It had to do with love. In our family, love was not distributed equally. My father, Calvin Stone, worked as an auto mechanic at a repair shop downtown. He was a quiet man, the kind who spoke rarely, and when he did, it was usually to agree with whatever my mother had already said. My mother, Lydia Stone, worked the checkout counter at a neighborhood grocery store. At home, she ran our household with the cold efficiency of someone who always believed she knew exactly who deserved what. And then, there was my sister, Vanessa. She was 2 years older than me. She had my mother's golden blonde hair, my mother's bright blue eyes, my mother's effortless laugh. Everyone always said the same thing whenever they saw them standing together. Vanessa looks exactly like you did at her age, Lydia. And my mother would glow with pride. I, on the other hand, looked like my grandmother, my father's mother. Brown hair, brown eyes, quiet personality. My mother never said that was a bad thing. She just never said much about me at all. And when you're a child, sometimes silence tells you everything you need to know. What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. The differences between Vanessa and me showed up in 100 small ways growing up. For Vanessa's 15th birthday, my mother Lydia threw a party that felt like something out of a movie. 15 guests packed our living room. There was a 3-tier cake from the fancy bakery on Hawthorne Boulevard, the kind with smooth white frosting and delicate pink flowers made from sugar. My mother even rented a karaoke machine for the night, so Vanessa and her friends could sing pop songs until midnight. Everyone laughed. Everyone took pictures. My mother stood in the kitchen glowing with pride while people told her how beautiful her daughter was. 3 months later, when my 13th birthday came around, things looked very different. It was just the 4 of us sitting around the kitchen table. No guests, no decorations, no music. My mother placed a discounted cake from the grocery store where she worked in front of me. The frosting said, "Happy birthday." That was it. No name. It was clearly a leftover cake from someone else's canceled order. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself birthdays were silly anyway. But even at 13, I could feel the quiet message behind moments like that. You matter less. The truth is, I didn't fully understand my role in the family until I was 12. That was the year I accidentally discovered Vanessa had a college savings account. I was looking for a notebook in my parents' bedroom when I found a bank statement sitting on my mother's dresser. The account had been opened when Vanessa was 5 years old. 8 years of deposits, thousands of dollars, money set aside carefully for her future. That night, I asked my mother why I didn't have one. She looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if the thought had never crossed her mind. "Vanessa needs money for college," Lydia said, while drying a plate at the sink. Then she glanced at me with mild indifference. "You'll figure something out. You're good at adapting." That was the moment something inside me shifted. I finally understood my place in that house. Vanessa was the investment. I was the backup plan. The extra child who happened to exist. The spare. Everything changed during the summer of 2010. In April of that year, my middle school science teacher handed out flyers about a program called the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University. It was a 6-week residential program for students who showed exceptional promise in science and mathematics. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, food, materials. The total value was $4,200. To a 13-year-old girl whose family barely spent money on her birthday cake, that number felt enormous. I filled out the application quietly. I never told anyone at home. By that point, I had already learned an important rule about my family. Hope was something you kept to yourself. On May 15th, the acceptance letter arrived. Out of more than 2,000 applicants across Oregon, only 50 students had been selected. I was one of them. For exactly one afternoon, I felt like I mattered. I remember sitting on my bed holding the letter, reading it over and over again, imagining what the campus would look like, and what it would feel like to be surrounded by other kids who loved science the way I did. For a few hours, I let myself believe that maybe my life could be bigger than the narrow walls of that house. Then Vanessa found out about a performing arts camp in California. Her drama teacher had recommended it to her. 3 weeks. No scholarship. The price was $1,800. That night at dinner, my mother announced the solution she had already decided on. "Amira," she said calmly while cutting her chicken, "you're going to decline that science program." I looked up from my plate. "What, we can't afford to send both of you to summer programs?" Lydia continued as if she were explaining a grocery budget. "Vanessa's camp will help her college applications. It's important for her future." She said it in the same tone someone might use when discussing meal planning, like she wasn't crushing someone's dream. I stared down at my plate. My heart was pounding. Before I could stop myself, the word slipped out. "No." The entire table went silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. My mother slowly set her fork down. "Excuse me." Her voice had dropped into the dangerous tone I had heard her use on customers at the grocery store when they tried to argue about expired coupons. I swallowed, but my voice stayed steady. "That scholarship isn't yours to give away," I said. "I earned it." My hands were shaking under the table. "It's mine." For a moment, my mother looked at me like I had suddenly become a stranger. Then her eyes hardened. "If you can't sacrifice for this family," she said slowly, "then you're not part of this family." At 13 years old, I thought she was just angry. I thought she was saying something she would regret later. I didn't realize she meant it literally. 3 days after that dinner, I came home from the public library and found my belongings sitting on the front porch. 2 black garbage bags. My clothes were stuffed inside them. My school books. My shoes. Everything I owned. My mother stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked calm, resolved. Like someone who had just finished an unpleasant chore and was relieved it was over. "I called Victor," she said. She was referring to my father's older brother, Uncle Victor Stone, who lived in Seattle. "He'll be here to pick you up." I stared at the bags, then back at her. "What do you mean?" My mother's expression didn't change. "From now on," she said flatly, "you're his problem." I stood there on the porch with the afternoon sun hitting the side of the house, trying to process what was happening. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. My mother wasn't threatening me. She was getting rid of me. Behind my mother, I could see my father standing in the hallway. My father, Calvin Stone, leaned against the wall like he had been standing there for a while. His arms hung loosely at his sides. His eyes were pointed in my direction, but he wasn't really looking at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't step forward. He didn't tell my mother she had gone too far. He simply stood there in silence. And somehow that silence hurt more than anything she had said. I looked up toward the second-floor window. The curtain shifted slightly. Vanessa was standing there. My older sister was watching everything from behind the thin fabric. Her face was half hidden by the shadow of her room. For a moment, our eyes met. I thought maybe she would come downstairs. Maybe she would say something. Maybe she would at least stand beside me on the porch. Instead, she slowly stepped back. The curtain fell into place. And she disappeared. I waited on that porch from 6 in the evening until 10 at night. 4 hours. My mother went back inside after the first 5 minutes. The porch light never came on. The sun slowly disappeared behind the houses across the street, and the evening air grew colder as darkness settled in. I sat on top of those 2 garbage bags with my knees pulled up to my chest, trying to make sense of the moment. 13 years of memories running through my head like a broken film reel. Uncle Victor lived in Seattle, 3 hours away. When my mother said she had called him, I didn't know if that meant he would actually come. But he did. At exactly 10 o'clock that night, a gray Honda sedan turned slowly into the driveway. The headlights swept across the porch and briefly illuminated me sitting there in the dark. The engine shut off. The car door opened. Uncle Victor stepped out. He didn't rush toward me. He didn't ask questions right away. He simply walked up the driveway and stopped in front of me. For a few seconds, he just looked at me. His eyes moved from the garbage bags to my face, taking in the entire situation without anyone needing to explain it. Then he did something no one in that house had ever done before. He wrapped his arms around me. The hug was so tight it almost knocked the air out of my lungs. I remember the smell of his jacket, the rough texture of the fabric against my cheek, and the quiet strength in the way he held me. "From now on," he said softly, "you have a home." Those 5 words changed the course of my life. That night we drove north toward Seattle. The highway was dark, the road stretching endlessly in front of us while rain tapped gently against the windshield. I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, trying to understand what had just happened. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. What did I do wrong? What had I done to make my own parents give up on me? What I didn't know at the time was that before Uncle Victor left Portland that night, my mother had signed a document. I didn't see it. I didn't understand it. I didn't even know it existed. It would take 15 years before that document appeared again. And when it did, it would change everything. Uncle Victor's house in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood wasn't large, but to me, it felt enormous. Compared to the cramped space I had grown up in, the place felt almost magical. The floors creaked softly when you walked across them. The living room smelled like old books and coffee. And for the first time in my life, I had a bedroom that belonged entirely to me. My own desk, my own bed, my own door that could close. But the most important thing Uncle Victor gave me wasn't a room, it was belief. Victor Stone had built Stone Property Holdings from the ground up. Years earlier, he had worked double shifts for 6 straight years to save enough money to buy a small commercial office building in Seattle. That single building eventually turned into a growing real estate business. By 2010, he owned 8 commercial properties across the Seattle metro area. He had never married. He had never had children. When I arrived on his doorstep with nothing but 2 garbage bags, he didn't treat me like a burden. He treated me like an opportunity. Over the next 4 years, I threw myself into school. I studied harder than I ever had in my life. Not because anyone forced me to, because for the first time, someone believed I could succeed. In 2014, I graduated from Ballard High School as class valedictorian, president of the math club, a perfect 4.0 GPA. Uncle Victor sat in the front row during graduation with the biggest smile I had ever seen on his face. The University of Washington accepted me into the Foster School of Business with a partial scholarship. By 2018, I had earned my bachelor's degree in finance, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.94 GPA. During college, Uncle Victor gave me internship opportunities at Stone Property Holdings. I started with the most basic work imaginable: data entry, lease paperwork, tenant phone calls, property inspection reports. Slowly, he taught me every part of the business from the ground up. After graduating, I spent 18 months working at a large accounting firm called Mitchell and Parker. That experience helped me earn my CPA certification in 2019. 1 year later, Uncle Victor offered me a full-time position at the company as controller. By 2021, I had been promoted to chief financial officer. On my 26th birthday, I was managing a portfolio of 12 commercial properties with a combined value of $23.7 million. That morning, Uncle Victor sent me an email. I still have it saved. The subject line read, "To my daughter." The message itself was simple. You don't need to prove anything to the people who abandoned you, but you do need to prove to yourself that you are worthy. And you already have. Happy birthday, Amira. I read that email at least 10 times that day. In 15 years, my biological family reached out exactly 3 times. The first time happened in 2012. My mother, Lydia, didn't call my phone. She called Uncle Victor's. And she didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask if I was safe. She didn't ask if I was happy. She asked for $5,000. She said my father, Calvin, had lost his job at the mechanic shop, and that times were hard. Apparently, the daughter they had thrown away was still useful when money was involved. That was the first time. It would not be the last. My mother, Lydia, told Uncle Victor that my father, Calvin, had lost his job at the auto repair shop. According to her, times were difficult and the family needed help. She said that surely Victor could lend money to his own brother. Uncle Victor refused. Later that evening, he told me about the phone call while we were sitting in the kitchen. I remember the way his jaw tightened as he spoke. "They never asked about you," he said quietly. I looked up from my homework. "Not once," he continued. "They didn't ask how you're doing in school. They didn't ask if you're okay. They didn't ask if you're happy." He shook his head slowly. "They just wanted money." That conversation stayed with me for a long time. It confirmed something I had already suspected but didn't want to admit out loud. To them, I was gone, but Uncle Victor's money still counted as family. The second time my biological family reached out happened in 2016. I was 20 years old and halfway through college when an envelope arrived at Uncle Victor's house addressed to me. The handwriting on the front looked familiar, though it had been years since I had seen it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Vanessa was getting married. There was no personal note, no letter, no message asking how I had been. Just the formal printed card with my name and Uncle Victor's Seattle address typed neatly beneath it. I stared at the invitation for a long time, then I placed it back in the envelope and put it in a drawer. I didn't attend the wedding. I didn't send a gift. I didn't respond at all. The third contact came 4 years later. In 2020, my mother sent me an email. It was the first time she had contacted me directly since the night she threw me out. The subject line read, "Checking in." The message mentioned that she had seen an article in the Seattle Business Journal about Stone Property Holdings expanding into the East Side market. Apparently, someone had mentioned my name in the article. She wrote that she hoped I was doing well and suggested that maybe we could catch up sometime. I read the email twice. Then I deleted it. Not because I was angry. Not because I was holding on to resentment. The truth was simpler than that. I had built a life that didn't include them, and I saw no reason to change that. Everything shifted in the summer of 2024. That was when Uncle Victor received the diagnosis that changed everything. Congestive heart failure, advanced stage. The doctors gave him 12 to 18 months. He lasted 8. Those months were some of the hardest of my life. Victor tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could see the fatigue creeping into his movements. Simple tasks began taking more energy. Some days he sat quietly on the back porch looking out over the neighborhood like he was memorizing the view. During that time, he met with his estate attorney several times. Her name was Margaret Lawson. She had been handling Victor's legal affairs for years. In June of 2024, he updated his will, 6 months before he passed away. One evening, I asked him about it while we were sitting in the living room. He just smiled. "Everything's taken care of," he said. "You focus on the business. I've handled the rest." I trusted him completely. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't know what he had written. I didn't know about the clauses. I had no idea what was coming. Uncle Victor passed away on February 28, 2025. He died peacefully in his sleep at Swedish Medical Center while I was holding his hand. I stayed there long after the machine stopped making noise. For the first time since I was 13 years old, I felt like I had lost my only parent. 1 week later, on March 7th, I was sitting in my office at Stone Property Holdings reviewing quarterly financial reports when my phone buzzed. The screen showed an unknown number from Portland. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Amira. The voice was instantly recognizable. 15 years hadn't changed the way Lydia Stone said my name. It always sounded like she was tasting something she wasn't sure she liked. Lydia, I replied calmly. I didn't call her mom. Just her name. There was a short pause on the line. I could almost hear her adjusting her tone. I heard about Victor, she said. I'm so sorry for your loss. Her voice carried a practiced softness that felt strangely artificial. I was thinking maybe I should come up for the memorial service. Pay my respects. The memorial was 3 days ago, I said. Another pause. Oh, she said quickly. Well, I also heard there's a will reading coming up. There it was. The real reason for the call. Family has a right to attend these things, she continued. Especially when it involves a brother's estate. I leaned back in my chair. How did you find out about the will reading? I have an attorney, Lydia said. Victor Harrington. He made a few calls. The name stirred a faint memory. Uncle Victor had mentioned a lawyer named Victor Harrington years ago. Apparently, they had consulted briefly, but Victor had ultimately decided not to work with him. After the call ended, I contacted Margaret Lawson. The next morning, she confirmed exactly what I suspected. Lydia and Calvin Stone had hired Victor Harrington to file a legal challenge against my uncle's will. Their argument was simple. Undue influence. They were claiming that I had manipulated a sick old man during the final months of his life in order to control his estate. They were also demanding to attend the will reading as immediate family members. I sat quietly in my office after hearing this. On my desk was a framed photograph of Uncle Victor taken a few years earlier during one of our company events. He was smiling in the picture. The expression almost looked amused. For a strange moment, it felt like he had expected something like this to happen. A few days later, I met Margaret Lawson in her office. Her firm occupied the 47th floor of the Columbia Center, the tallest building in Seattle. On a clear day, you could see all the way to Mount Rainier through the massive windows behind her desk. But March 10th was not a clear day. Rain streaked across the glass while the city below looked gray and distant. Margaret slid a folder across the table toward me. Victor Harrington has filed a formal challenge to the will, she said calmly. The paperwork inside listed my parents' names as the claimants: Lydia Stone, Calvin Stone. They were demanding a portion of Uncle Victor's estate. I stared at the documents in silence, feeling an odd mixture of disbelief and inevitability. 15 years of silence. And now they were back. Not because they missed me, not because they regretted what they had done. They were back because they believed there was money waiting for them. Margaret folded her hands on the desk. "This could get complicated," she said. And she was right. Because what my parents didn't know yet was that Uncle Victor had prepared for exactly this situation. Margaret Lawson leaned back slightly in her chair as I finished reading the legal filing. "The claim alleges undue influence," she said calmly. "They are arguing that you isolated Victor from his family during his illness and pressured him to change his estate plan." I felt my stomach tighten as I scanned through the document again. Each paragraph twisted the story of my life into something unrecognizable. "They're demanding 50% of the estate," Margaret continued. I looked up from the papers. 50%? She nodded. "Their legal theory is that since Calvin Stone is Victor's only surviving brother, he should inherit under intestacy principles. At minimum, they argue he deserves a significant portion of the estate because of what they call the natural bonds of brotherhood." I let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "Natural bonds?" I repeated. Margaret watched me carefully. "Calvin and Victor hadn't spoken for 8 years before I even came to live with him," I said. "Did you know that?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm aware. Victor told me the entire history." She tapped the folder with one finger. "But that's not the part that concerns me." She pulled out another document and slid it toward me. "They don't actually need to win this case." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If this dispute goes to litigation," Margaret explained, "the estate could be frozen for 12 to 18 months while the courts sort everything out. During that time, the properties still need to be managed. Tenants need support. Bills must be paid. Maintenance has to continue." She paused for a moment. "A long legal battle could easily cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. It could also destabilize the entire portfolio." Understanding began to settle in. "So they're betting I'll pay them to go away." Margaret gave a small nod. "That's exactly the strategy." She folded her hands on the desk. "It's very common in estate disputes." I looked down at the filing again. In the section describing our family history, Lydia had written that I had abandoned my family and taken advantage of Victor's loneliness in order to gain control of his wealth. I stared at the words for several seconds. The woman who had thrown me out of the house when I was 13 was now claiming that I had abandoned her. Margaret broke the silence. "Do you have any documentation from 2010? I looked up. Documentation. Anything that establishes what actually happened when you went to live with Victor. Any records, statements, reports." My mind flashed back to that night. The porch, the garbage bags, the 4 hours sitting in the dark, Victor's headlights turning into the driveway. "I was 13, I said quietly. "I didn't exactly keep records." Margaret studied me for a moment. Then she reached for the phone on her desk. "Victor did." She dialed her assistant and requested a specific file number from the firm's archive storage. 20 minutes later, the assistant returned with a yellowed folder that looked like it had been sitting untouched for years. Margaret opened it carefully. Her eyes moved slowly across the pages inside. Then she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Amira," she said gently, "did you know about this?" She slid the document across the desk toward me. I read the header. "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship, dated July 15th, 2010. My eyes moved slowly down the page. The document stated that Calvin Stone and Lydia Stone, being of sound mind, voluntarily relinquished all parental rights and responsibilities for their minor daughter Amira Stone. It further declared that full legal guardianship was being transferred to Victor Stone. At the bottom of the page were 4 signatures: my mother's, my father's, Uncle Victor's, and a notary public from King County. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. "They didn't just throw you out," Margaret said quietly. "They legally gave you up." She tapped the document lightly. "They signed away their parental rights." My hands were trembling as I held the paper. 15 years ago, I had been sitting on a dark porch with 2 garbage bags full of clothes. While I sat there waiting, my parents had been inside signing legal documents that erased me from their lives. "What does this mean for their claim?" I asked finally. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. "It means Calvin Stone has no legal standing to challenge the will through familial connection." She pointed to the document. "As far as the law is concerned, Calvin and Lydia Stone stopped being your parents the moment they signed this." The room fell silent. For a moment, I could almost hear the echo of that night 15 years ago. Margaret leaned forward again. "I can offer you 2 possible paths forward." I looked up. "Option 1," she said, "we negotiate." She folded the document neatly back into the folder. "I contact Victor Harrington and explain that their legal position is far weaker than they think. We offer a settlement somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in exchange for them withdrawing their claim and signing a waiver against any future challenges." She paused. "It would be fast, quiet, and it would avoid turning this into a public spectacle." I considered that for a moment. "And the second option?" Margaret's eyes held mine. "We proceed with the will reading exactly as scheduled." She continued. "They've demanded to attend as family members. We allow them to attend." Her voice grew slightly firmer. "And then, we present the evidence. The guardianship document. The history. Everything Victor wanted revealed if this situation ever occurred." She sat back in her chair. "Victor anticipated this, Amira." My chest tightened. "He left very specific instructions." Margaret looked down at the folder once more. "He wanted the truth on record." That night, I went home to the house Victor had left me. Sleep was impossible. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photos on the mantel. There were pictures of me at every stage of my life: high school graduation, college commencement, my first day working full-time at the company. In every photo, Victor was standing beside me with that same proud smile. There were no pictures of Calvin, none of Lydia, none of Vanessa. They had never existed in this house. As I sat there in the quiet, the weight of Margaret's question kept echoing in my mind. Settlement or truth? Pay them to disappear, or let the world see what really happened 15 years ago? And deep down, I already knew which one Victor would have chosen. Do you think the text revealing Lydia and Calvin relinquished their legal parental rights 15 years ago will completely reverse the balance of power when the will reading begins? If you agree, leave a 1 in the comments. Your opinion really matters here. I sat there for a long time staring at the photos on the mantel. High school graduation, college commencement, the day I received my CPA license, the morning I officially became CFO of Stone Property Holdings. In every single picture, Uncle Victor stood beside me with that same proud smile. But there were no photos of Calvin Stone. None of Lydia. None of Vanessa. Not a single one. They had never been part of this life. I thought about something Victor wrote to me years earlier in that birthday email. "You don't owe them anything, but you do owe yourself the truth." The next morning, at exactly 7 o'clock, I called Margaret Lawson. "I want the will reading to proceed," I told her. "No settlement. No buyout." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "If they want to show up," I said, "let them." I looked again at the photos on the mantel. "But we're not hiding anything." Margaret let out a slow breath. "Once this becomes public, there's no taking it back. They made it public the moment they filed their challenge," I replied. "I'm just respecting their choice." The will reading was scheduled for Friday, March 14th, 2025, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 5 days away. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. My best friend, Elena Ramirez, spent most of that week in my office helping organize everything. Elena had joined Stone Property Holdings 3 years earlier as the company's HR director, but she had quickly become much more than a coworker. She was one of the only people who knew the full story of my childhood. On Wednesday evening, she looked up from her laptop with a raised eyebrow. 47 emails, she said. 47. She nodded. Victor sent you 47 emails over the past 10 years talking about your relationship and explaining why he distanced himself from Calvin. She turned the screen toward me. The emails painted a very clear picture. In 2002, Calvin Stone had borrowed $80,000 from Victor with a written promise to repay it within 5 years. 23 years had passed. Not a single dollar had been returned. That broken promise had fractured their relationship long before I ever entered the picture. My arrival in 2010 had nothing to do with the estrangement. The damage had already existed for 8 years. Elena then opened another file. These are the company performance reports from the last 3 years. Under my leadership as CFO, the value of the Stone Property Holdings portfolio had grown from $17.7 million to $23.7 million, a 34% increase. Occupancy rates averaged 96% across all properties. Tenant satisfaction scores were the highest in the company's history. Elena leaned back in her chair. If anyone tries to claim you manipulated Victor to get control of the company, she said, these numbers tell a very different story. On Thursday evening, I met with Dr. Melissa Hart. I had been seeing her since my early 20s. Her office was quiet, softly lit, and smelled faintly of lavender. She listened patiently while I explained everything that had happened. Then she asked a simple question. Remember why you're doing this? I leaned back in the chair. I'm not seeking revenge. Dr. Hart nodded. You're closing a chapter, she said. There's a difference. I hesitated. What if I feel satisfaction when they realize they've lost? She smiled gently. That's called justice. She folded her hands in her lap. Feeling validated when the truth comes out isn't cruelty. The real question is what you do after that moment. Later that night, I drove home through Seattle's rain-slicked streets, thinking about her words. When I got home, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. She has no power over you anymore, I told my reflection quietly. Only you get to decide your story now. Friday was coming, and for the first time in my life, I felt ready. Let me pause for a moment. If you've made it this far and you're wondering how everything unfolded during the will reading, drop a comment with your prediction. What do you think Lydia Stone did when she walked into that room? And if this story resonates with you, especially if you've ever had to set boundaries with family, make sure you subscribe. Because we're about to reach the moment everything changes. Now let's go back to that Friday afternoon. The Morrison and Lawson conference room sat on the corner of the 47th floor of Columbia Center. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded the room, offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. On a clear day, the view was breathtaking. But on March 14, 2025, the sky was heavy with clouds. The water below looked dark and steel gray. And inside that conference room, something far more dramatic than the weather was about to unfold. On a clear day, the view from the 47th floor of Columbia Center could stop you in your tracks. Mountains in the distance, Elliott Bay stretching toward the horizon, ferries moving slowly across the water like quiet white lines. But on March 14, 2025, the sky was completely overcast. The water below looked dull and steel gray. It matched my mood perfectly. I arrived 15 minutes early at exactly 1:45 p.m. I was wearing a navy blue tailored suit. Clean lines, simple cut. Professional without trying too hard. My hair was pulled back into a neat bun, Uncle Victor had once told me something I never forgot. The most powerful person in the room is usually the one who doesn't feel the need to announce themselves. I kept that in mind as I stepped into the conference room. The room was large enough to seat about 20 people at the main table, with additional chairs placed neatly along the walls for observers. When I entered, 14 people were already present. Margaret Lawson sat at the head of the table with 2 junior associates beside her, quietly organizing documents. Near the window sat Thomas Green, the senior auditor from Mitchell and Parker. He had handled Victor's financial accounts for nearly a decade. 3 representatives from charitable organizations were seated together along the far side of the room: Seattle Children's Hospital, Habitat for Humanity Northwest, the Olympic National Park Foundation. Victor had been a major donor to all 3 for more than 20 years. 5 senior staff members from Stone Property Holdings sat near the door. They had worked with Victor for years and had known me since my earliest days as an intern. Margaret noticed me as soon as I entered. She gave a small nod and gestured toward a seat at the center of the table directly across from where she would be reading the will. I walked over calmly and sat down. In front of me, I placed the folder Elena had prepared containing every document we might need. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see the elevator lobby outside. At exactly 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. My mother stepped out first. Even from across the floor, I could tell she had dressed carefully for the occasion. Lydia wore a black dress and a pearl necklace, her makeup perfectly done. Behind her came my father, Calvin, my sister, Vanessa, and a tall man carrying an expensive briefcase. Their attorney, Victor Harrington. The show was about to begin. Lydia Stone entered the conference room as if she owned it. That had always been her style, projecting confidence she hadn't earned, claiming authority no one had given her. The black dress looked brand new. The pearls caught the overhead lights as she surveyed the room with an expression of carefully practiced grief. Behind her, Calvin shuffled inside wearing a gray suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He had gained weight over the years. When his eyes briefly met mine, he quickly looked away. He had always been very good at looking away. Vanessa followed in a pastel pink dress, an unusual choice for a will reading. It almost looked like she had mistaken the event for a bridal shower. At 30 years old, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early flight from Portland. Victor Harrington entered last. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades in high-stakes courtrooms. The Mont Blanc briefcase in his hand probably cost more than my first month's salary when I worked at Mitchell and Parker. Lydia's gaze swept the room until it landed on me. "Ah!" she said loudly. "You're here already." I remained seated. "Lydia," I replied. "Not Mom. Just Lydia." For a split second she hesitated. Something flickered across her face before she quickly recovered. "I was hoping we could speak privately before this starts," she said. "Family matters should be handled by family." "The proceedings begin in 2 minutes," I said calmly. "I'm sure whatever you want to say can wait." Margaret Lawson stood up from her seat. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, Ms. Stone, Mr. Harrington," she said professionally. "There are chairs arranged along the wall for attending parties. The main table is reserved for beneficiaries and estate representatives." Lydia's jaw tightened. She had clearly expected to sit at the center of the room. Instead, she was being directed to the sidelines. She wasn't even at the table. But Lydia Stone never accepted humiliation quietly. Instead of taking her seat immediately, she walked past the representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital and paused beside them with an expression of polite sorrow. "I'm Lydia Stone," she announced loudly enough for most of the room to hear. "Victor's sister-in-law. We were very close for many years before this unfortunate estrangement." She glanced meaningfully in my direction. The hospital representative, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Eleanor Price, simply nodded politely without responding. But Lydia wasn't finished. "It's tragic," she continued, "how some people enter a family and cause division. Victor was such a generous man. Perhaps too trusting." I kept my eyes on the folder in front of me. I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that Lydia thrived on reactions. Vanessa added her own comment as she sat down along the wall. Uncle Victor used to visit us in Portland all the time when we were kids, she said. I don't understand why she gets to sit up there while we're back here. Victor Harrington was already writing notes on a legal pad documenting every word spoken in the room. He was waiting for any reaction he could twist into evidence. I gave him nothing. Lydia finally sat down beside Vanessa. But she still wasn't finished. As Margaret arranged the final pages of the will at the head of the table, Lydia spoke again, her voice cutting through the quiet room. A child rejected by her own parents usually has a reason, she said. I just wish Victor had seen through her the way we did. A mother always knows. The words hung in the air like smoke. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Thomas Green stared openly at Lydia with clear disbelief. For the first time in 15 years, I studied my mother carefully. She hadn't changed at all. The same certainty. The same need to control the narrative. The same unwavering belief that she was always the victim. Margaret cleared her throat. It is now 2:10 p.m. She lifted a large sealed envelope and broke the seal with practiced precision. This, she began, is the last will and testament of Victor Raymond Stone. Her voice carried across the room with quiet authority. And suddenly, every person present leaned forward slightly. Because the moment Lydia Stone had traveled hundreds of miles for had finally arrived. Margaret Lawson's voice carried evenly through the room as she continued reading. Victor Raymond Stone. Born July 4, 1953. Deceased, February 28, 2025. This document was executed on June 18, 2024, and represents the final expression of Mr. Stone's wishes regarding the disposition of his estate. Lydia leaned forward slightly in her chair along the wall. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she focused on every word. Margaret continued with the opening sections of the will. Article 1 confirmed Victor's identity and residence. Article 2 declared that he had been of sound mind when the document was signed. Margaret paused briefly before adding another detail. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted by Dr. Michael Chen on June 10, 2024, 8 days prior to the execution of this will. The evaluation confirmed that Mr. Stone possessed full testamentary capacity and was under no undue influence at the time of signing. I caught Lydia exchanging a quick glance with Victor Harrington. They had clearly been hoping to challenge Victor's mental condition. This statement complicated their strategy immediately. Margaret continued. Article 3 revokes all previous wills and codicils. She then turned the page. Article 4 contains the inventory of assets. The room became even quieter. At the time of death, the estate of Victor Raymond Stone included 12 commercial properties located throughout King County and Snohomish County, with a combined assessed value of $18.2 million. Vanessa leaned toward Lydia and whispered quietly. That's almost $24 million. Margaret continued reading. Investment accounts containing diversified equity holdings valued at approximately $4.1 million. Cash and liquid assets totaling $1.4 million. Lydia's eyes moved quickly, calculating. Margaret looked up briefly. The will contains 47 pages. She adjusted her glasses and turned to the next section. I will now proceed to Article 5, which addresses specific exclusions and explanations. She cleared her throat. Article 5 regarding Calvin Stone, brother of the deceased. Lydia actually smiled. She wouldn't be smiling for long. Margaret began reading Victor's words. I make no provision in this will for my brother Calvin Stone for the following reasons which I wish to be read aloud and entered into the record. Lydia's smile faltered. Margaret continued. First, in March of 2002, Calvin Stone borrowed $80,000 from me with a written promise to repay the full amount within 5 years. 23 years have passed. Not $1 has been repaid. I retain the original promissory note as documentation. Calvin's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected that detail to be made public. Margaret turned the page. Second, on July 15, 2010. Calvin Stone and his wife, Lydia Stone, voluntarily executed a legal document relinquishing all parental rights to their daughter, Amira Stone, and transferring full legal guardianship to me. This document was properly witnessed and notarized. Lydia shot to her feet. What does that have to do with anything? Margaret didn't acknowledge the interruption. She simply continued reading. The significance of this document is as follows. By legally terminating their parental relationship with Amira Stone, Calvin and Lydia Stone severed any claim they might attempt to assert through her. Amira Stone is my legal heir. Calvin Stone is not her legal father. Therefore, he has no familial standing to challenge this will on grounds of family connection. Calvin stood up as well. This is ridiculous, he said. I'm Victor's brother. His blood brother. Victor Harrington quickly grabbed Calvin's arm and pulled him back down into his seat. But even the lawyer's face had gone noticeably pale. Margaret calmly reached into her file and removed another document. For the record, she said, the original relinquishment of parental rights is on file with King County Family Court under file number 2010GH5847. I have a certified copy here available for examination. She placed the document on the table. Lydia stared at it like it might explode. She remained standing. The calm mask she had worn when entering the room was cracking visibly. This is insane, she said, her voice rising. That paper means nothing. We're still her family. Margaret's voice stayed steady. Mrs. Stone, I must ask you to take your seat. Disrupting the reading of a will is a matter the court takes seriously. Lydia ignored her. She pointed directly at me. She did this, she shouted. She manipulated Victor. She poisoned him against his own family. One of the charity representatives shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Dr. Eleanor Price from Seattle Children's Hospital looked like she had not expected to witness a family meltdown. Vanessa tugged nervously at Lydia's sleeve. Mom, sit down, she whispered. People are watching. I don't care who's watching, Lydia snapped. Victor loved Calvin. They were brothers. Finally, I spoke. My voice came out calm and quiet, exactly the way Victor had always taught me to speak in negotiations. Never raise your voice. Make them lean closer to hear you. Lydia, I said. You made a choice 15 years ago. The room fell completely silent. You packed my belongings into garbage bags and left me sitting on a porch in the dark. Then you went inside and signed a legal document giving me away. I met her eyes. I was 13 years old. No one in the room moved. That was your decision, I continued quietly. Not mine. Not Victor's. Yours. I folded my hands on the table. Everything happening today is simply the consequence of what you chose that night. Lydia opened her mouth, but no words came out. I don't hate you, I said calmly. But I don't owe you anything either. You made sure of that when you signed that paper. Victor Harrington was scribbling furiously in his notebook, though I couldn't imagine what argument he thought he could still build. Margaret cleared her throat. If we may continue. She looked down at the document again. I have not yet read Article 7. Lydia slowly sank back into her chair. But Article 7 was the moment that would destroy whatever hope she had left. Margaret turned to page 12. She paused. Then she read the line that would change everything. Article 7. Designation of sole beneficiary. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all real property, investment accounts, liquid assets, and personal effects, to my legally adopted daughter, Amira Stone. The word adopted echoed in the room like a thunderclap. Lydia's face turned completely white. Not pale. White. Like all the blood had suddenly drained from her body. Adopted Calvin's voice sounded hoarse, like the word itself had scraped his throat on the way out. Since when Margaret Lawson didn't rush her answer. Her voice remained as calm and precise as it had been since the beginning of the reading. Mr. Victor Stone formally adopted Amira Stone on September 12, 2012, when she was 15 years old. The adoption was finalized in King County Family Court under file number 2012 AD 3291. She turned another page. As Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Stone had already legally relinquished their parental rights in 2010, no additional consent was required. Vanessa stared at me from across the room. "So you're not even related to us anymore?" I met her gaze. "Not legally," I said quietly. "Not since you and Mom signed me away." Margaret continued reading from the will. "Amira Stone is not merely a beneficiary. She is my daughter in every way that matters legally, practically, and emotionally." Her voice softened slightly as she read Victor's words. "She has worked beside me for years. She has proven her competence, her integrity, and her dedication to the business we built together. I trust her completely to continue the work I began." The room remained silent. There is no one more deserving of this inheritance, and there is no one I love more. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, trying to clear the tears that had suddenly filled my eyes. Victor had never shown me the full language of that clause. He had kept it hidden, waiting for this moment. Lydia shook her head slowly, like someone trying to wake from a nightmare. "This can't be legal," she whispered. She turned toward their lawyer. "Victor, tell them this can't be legal." Victor Harrington didn't respond. He was staring down at his legal pad, his pen completely still. The confidence he had carried into the room was gone. He knew the case was already collapsing. Margaret reached into her folder and removed a smaller sealed envelope. "There is one more item," she said. "Mr. Stone left a personal letter addressed to Amira. He instructed that a portion of it be read aloud during this proceeding if Amira consents." I nodded slowly. My throat was too tight to trust my voice. Margaret opened the envelope carefully and unfolded a single sheet of paper. I recognized Victor's handwriting instantly. The same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards, sticky notes, and the dozens of encouraging emails he had sent me over the years. Margaret began reading. "Amira, if this letter is being read aloud, it means events unfolded exactly as I expected." Lydia made a small sound in the back of her throat. Margaret continued. "Your biological family has arrived hoping to claim money they never earned from a man they never cared about. I am sorry you have to go through this." She paused briefly before continuing. "But I also know you are strong enough to handle it." The room remained perfectly still. "You came to me as a wounded child, a child thrown away by people who should have protected you." My chest tightened as the words filled the room. "But you refused to let that define your life. You transformed pain into determination, loneliness into independence, rejection into resilience." Margaret's voice softened further. "I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." The tears were running freely down my face now. I didn't bother trying to hide them. "I did not save you, Amira," the letter continued. "You saved yourself. I simply gave you a place where you could do it." Margaret looked down at the page. "Everything you achieved, your education, your career, your character, you earned all of it." Her voice grew firm again as she finished the paragraph. "I am leaving you my estate not because you need it, but because you deserve it. And because I know you will use it to help others the way I tried to help you." My hands trembled slightly as I wiped the tears from my cheeks. Margaret continued reading the final lines. "Do not allow anyone to make you feel guilty for surviving them. Do not allow them back into your life unless it is your choice. You owe them nothing. You owe yourself everything. I love you, Amira. Forever, your father, Victor." Silence filled the conference room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lydia stood up again. But this time her voice sounded different. The anger had disappeared. In its place was something that tried to sound like wounded motherhood. "Amira, sweetheart," she said softly. "I know things were difficult when you were young. I made mistakes. I admit that now." She clasped her hands together. "But we're still blood. We can work through this. Maybe we can talk about dividing the estate fairly." I looked at her calmly and wiped the last tear from my cheek. "You gave up the right to call me sweetheart 15 years ago." Lydia's face hardened instantly. "I want to contest this," will she announce to the room. "Victor, tell them we have grounds. Undue influence. He was sick. She isolated him." Victor Harrington finally spoke, but the voice that came out sounded tired. "Mrs. Stone, perhaps we should discuss our options privately." "No," Lydia snapped. "Tell them we're fighting this." Before Victor could respond, Margaret slowly turned her tablet around so the screen faced the room. "Mr. Harrington," she said calmly, "perhaps you would like to explain this to your clients." The room fell quiet again. Margaret began reading from the screen. "This is an email dated March 3, 2022, from Victor Stone to Victor Harrington. The subject line reads, 'Terminating services.'" She looked up briefly before continuing. In the email, Mr. Stone writes, "Victor, I am ending our professional relationship. Your recommendation that I include Calvin Stone in my estate plan despite his years of financial exploitation and his treatment of Amira is unacceptable. I will be engaging new counsel." Margaret lifted her eyes toward Harrington. "You previously represented Victor Stone. Your services were terminated because you advocated for Calvin Stone's interests against Victor's wishes." Her voice remained steady. "And now you have accepted representation against Victor's estate without disclosing that conflict of interest to your current clients." Victor Harrington's face turned gray. Lydia slowly turned toward him. "You told me we would win." He didn't answer. Instead, he abruptly stood up and grabbed his briefcase. "I need to review these documents," he said stiffly. "We should discuss this privately." "Discuss what?" Lydia's voice rose sharply. "You're leaving?" Victor Harrington didn't reply. He simply walked toward the door with stiff, hurried steps. "Victor," Lydia shouted after him. But he was already gone. The conference room door closed behind him with a quiet click. Lydia stood frozen in the middle of the room, abandoned by her own lawyer in front of everyone she had hoped to impress. Calvin sat slumped in his chair, staring down at the floor. He had followed Lydia's lead his entire life, and now she had led them both straight off a cliff. Vanessa was crying quietly beside her. I couldn't tell whether she was crying because of the money they had lost or because of the humiliation they had just experienced in front of an entire room of witnesses. Lydia turned back toward me one more time. The mask she had worn since walking into the room was completely gone now. The confident expression, the carefully rehearsed sorrow, the quiet arrogance. All of it had collapsed. What remained was desperation. And underneath that, something that might have been the beginning of regret. "Amira," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "we can still... we're still family, aren't we?" Her eyes searched my face. "Blood is blood. You could still..." I slowly stood up from my chair. "Lydia," I said calmly, "you stopped being my family on July 15th, 2010. I watched the words land. You signed that document yourself. I didn't make that choice. You did." I picked up the folder from the table and held it against my side. "I don't hate you," I continued quietly, "but you have no claim on me. Not legally, not emotionally, not in any way that matters." Then I turned back toward Margaret. "Can we continue with the remaining articles?" Margaret nodded. Lydia sank heavily back into her chair. For the rest of the reading, she didn't say another word. Margaret flipped several pages with practiced calm. "Article 9, she announced. Charitable bequests." The representatives from the three charities straightened slightly in their seats. Margaret began reading. I direct that the following gifts be made from my estate. She glanced down at the document. $500,000 to Seattle Children's Hospital for the establishment of a scholarship fund supporting children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Dr. Eleanor Price nodded solemnly. $300,000 to Habitat for Humanity, Northwest for the construction of affordable housing in the greater Seattle area. The Habitat representative smiled slightly. $200,000 to the Olympic National Park Foundation for wilderness preservation and environmental education programs. Dr. Price spoke softly. Victor was one of our most consistent donors for more than 20 years. This gift will help hundreds of families. The representative from Habitat added quietly, We built 6 homes with Victor's earlier donations. This will fund at least 4 more. Margaret continued reading. I also request that my daughter Amira Stone continue the charitable giving programs I established during my lifetime at her discretion. I trust her judgment completely. For the first time since the reading began, I spoke. I will, I said softly. I'll honor everything Victor built. As I looked around the room, a realization slowly settled in. The charity representatives weren't here because the law required them to attend. Victor had asked them to come. He had wanted witnesses, neutral observers who could later confirm exactly what had happened in that room. Even after his death, he had anticipated every possible move Lydia and Calvin might try. Dr. Price caught my eye and offered a warm smile. Victor used to talk about you constantly, she said, at board meetings, at donor events. Amira did this. Amira achieved that. Her smile widened. He was incredibly proud of you. I blinked quickly to keep the fresh tears from falling again. Even now, Victor had surrounded me with people who believed in me. Margaret closed the final page of the will. Then she looked toward me. Ms. Stone, as sole beneficiary and executor, would you like to say a few words? I hadn't planned to speak. But as I looked around the room and saw dozens of eyes watching me, I realized there were things that needed to be said. Not for Lydia. Not for Calvin. For myself. I stood up slowly. Most of you knew Victor much longer than I did, I began. He took me in when I was 13 years old and had absolutely nothing. I looked toward the employees from Stone Property Holdings. He gave me a home, an education. But more importantly, he gave me a family that chose to love me. My eyes moved across the room. The employees who had watched me grow from an intern into the company's CFO. The charity representatives who had witnessed Victor's generosity for decades. With this inheritance, I continued, I intend to continue everything Victor built. The properties will be managed with the same integrity he believed in. The charitable commitments will remain in place. I took a slow breath. And I will also be establishing a new program. Several people leaned forward slightly. The Victor Stone STEM Scholarship. It will support young students from difficult family situations who need someone to believe in them. My eyes drifted back to Lydia. She was sitting rigidly in her chair staring at the table. As for my biological relatives, I said calmly, I hold no grudges. I let the words settle. I've made peace with what happened. I paused. But peace does not mean pretending it never happened. And it doesn't mean reopening doors I worked very hard to close. I straightened slightly. Victor taught me that family is not defined by blood. It's defined by the people who show up for you when everything falls apart. I gestured lightly around the room. By that definition, the people in this room who knew Victor worked beside him and respected him. You are far more my family than the people who simply share my DNA. I sat down again. For a moment, the room remained completely silent. Then Thomas Green slowly began clapping. One by one, others joined him. The applause filled the room. Lydia didn't move. Margaret checked the time. The will has now been read in its entirety, she said formally. All legal requirements have been satisfied. She turned toward me. Ms. Stone, you may contact our office next week to begin the transfer process. The estate should be fully settled within 14 business days. People began standing and gathering their things. Quiet conversations filled the room. Lydia slowly stood up. In just 2 hours, she looked like she had aged 10 years. Calvin had already begun shuffling toward the door without looking at anyone. Vanessa silently grabbed her purse and followed him. Lydia lingered. She turned back toward me one last time. Her makeup had smeared slightly around her eyes. The confident woman who had walked into the room expecting millions now looked smaller somehow. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something. For a second I thought she might say I'm sorry. But the words never came. She closed her mouth, turned away, and walked out of the room. I watched her go. The woman who had thrown me away like damaged goods. The woman who had signed documents to make it legal. The woman who returned 15 years later expecting to profit from that cruelty. What I felt in that moment wasn't satisfaction. Not exactly. It was something quieter, a strange emptiness that comes when a chapter finally closes. Dr. Eleanor Price approached me as the room began to empty. Victor talked about you constantly, she said while shaking my hand. He once told me that taking you in was the best decision he ever made. She handed me a business card. When you're ready to discuss that scholarship fund, call me directly. A moment later, Elena appeared beside me and squeezed my arm. You did it, she whispered. Victor would be so proud. I looked down at the small framed photo of Victor I had brought with me. I hoped she was right. I need to take a breath here for a moment. Standing up to someone who hurt you, especially when they still believe they are the victim, is exhausting. 1 week after the will reading, Margaret Lawson filed a formal complaint with the Washington State Bar Association. The subject of the complaint was Victor Harrington and his ethical violations. I didn't ask Margaret to do it. She made the decision herself because, as she explained to me, attorneys are required to report professional misconduct when they witness it. The complaint listed 3 specific violations. First, conflict of interest. Harrington had previously represented Victor Stone and had gained confidential knowledge about Victor's estate planning. Second, failure to disclose. Harrington never informed Lydia or Calvin that he had previously worked for Victor. Third, misrepresentation. Harrington had encouraged his clients to pursue a legal challenge even though he knew their position was fundamentally weak. Margaret kept me updated during the investigation. 2 months later, at the end of May 2025, the Bar Association issued its ruling. Victor Harrington was suspended from practicing law for 6 months. He was also fined $15,000 and ordered to complete additional ethics training. Within weeks of the suspension, several of his largest clients quietly moved their legal work to other firms. Through conversations within the Seattle legal community, I later heard that his firm lost nearly $200,000 in revenue that year. One evening, Elena asked me if I felt satisfied about what had happened to him. I shook my head. I didn't do anything to him, I said. He did it to himself. That was the truth. I hadn't filed the complaint. I hadn't pushed for an investigation. Harrington had made his own decisions. He chose to take a case that was ethically compromised. He chose to mislead his clients. He chose to gamble that intimidation would work better than the truth. And eventually, the consequences caught up with him. Some people build their own prisons. 3 weeks after the will reading, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender address read, lydiastone1969@gmail.com. The subject line said simply, "Please read." I opened it cautiously. The message was longer than I expected. Lydia had never liked writing emails. She preferred phone calls where she could interrupt people and control the conversation. The email began, "Amira, I know you probably won't read this, but I need to say some things. I've been thinking about what happened at the will reading. I was angry and said things I shouldn't have." She continued, "I know I made mistakes when you were young. Your father and I were struggling financially, and I was overwhelmed. Things got out of control. I'm not asking you for money. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. We are still family, Amira. Blood doesn't disappear because of legal paperwork. I'm still your mother. Nothing can change that. Can we talk? I read the email 3 times. Then I called my therapist, Dr. Melissa Hart, and read it to her over the phone. What do you notice about the message, she asked. I thought about it for a moment. She admits mistakes, I said slowly, but she never actually says what the mistakes were. Dr. Hart waited. She blames circumstances, financial stress, being overwhelmed. I continued. She says she's not asking for money, but then immediately talks about rebuilding the relationship. And she still calls herself my mother, I added quietly, even though she signed away that right. Dr. Hart asked the most important question. What do you want to do? It took me 2 days to write my response. It was only 4 sentences long. Lydia, I read your email. I forgave you a long time ago, but that forgiveness was for my own peace, not for reconciliation. I don't want a relationship with you. Please don't contact me again. She never replied, and surprisingly, I didn't feel guilt. Only clarity. 2 months later, another message arrived. This time, it wasn't an email. It was an actual letter. The envelope looked slightly wrinkled and carried a Portland postmark. The return address listed the name T. Warren. Vanessa had taken her ex-husband's last name when she married. I opened the letter carefully, expecting another attempt to manipulate me. Instead, I found something very different. Amira, I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I don't want money. I don't want forgiveness. I just need to say something I should have said 15 years ago. My hands tightened slightly as I continued reading. The night Mom and Dad kicked you out, I was watching from my bedroom window. I saw you sitting on the porch with those garbage bags. I watched you sit there for 4 hours. The words blurred for a second. I saw you alone in the dark, and I didn't come downstairs. I could have. I was 15. I could have brought you water or sat with you or told you I was sorry, but I didn't. I just stood behind the curtain like a coward, and that moment has haunted me ever since. The letter continued. Every time Mom talked about you, after that, blaming you for everything, I remembered that window. I remembered that I did nothing. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking for a relationship. I just needed you to know that I understand now that I failed you. You deserved better from your sister. I read the letter 4 times. It was the first honest thing anyone in my biological family had ever said to me. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to think about what that honesty meant. But for the first time in 15 years, when I thought about Vanessa, I didn't feel only distance. 4 months after the will reading, I finally wrote back. Dr. Hart had helped me think through what I truly wanted, not what would make me look generous, not what society expected, what I genuinely wanted. The answer surprised me. I didn't want to shut Vanessa out completely. Her letter had contained something no one else in my family had ever offered. Accountability. No excuses, no requests, just the truth. But trust does not rebuild overnight. So I wrote back with conditions. Vanessa, I read your letter many times. I appreciate that you acknowledged what happened without excuses. That took courage. I am not ready for a full relationship, but I am open to cautious contact under certain conditions. I continued writing. First, there will be no communication through Lydia or Calvin. I have ended contact with them permanently. Second, there will be no discussion about money, inheritance, or anything connected to Victor's estate. Third, I reserve the right to end any conversation without explanation. If I stop responding, you must respect that. If those boundaries work for you, we can start with a short video call once a month. 15 minutes. Low pressure. If that goes well, we can slowly build from there. 3 days later, her reply arrived. 1 word. Accepted. Our first video call was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in September 2025, 6 months after the will reading. I sat in my home office with my laptop open, watching the clock slowly approach 2 o'clock. My heart was beating faster than it had during the will reading, because confronting an enemy is one thing. Allowing someone back into your life even cautiously is something else entirely. This felt more dangerous somehow. Standing up to Lydia during the will reading had been about defending myself from an attack. That kind of strength was straightforward. You put up a wall and hold your ground. But this was different. This was about lowering the wall just enough to see what was on the other side. The video call connected. Vanessa's face appeared on my laptop screen. She looked different than she had at the will reading. There was less makeup, less effort to appear polished. She looked tired, but there was something else there too. Something more honest. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." For a moment, we just stared at each other. 15 years compressed into a small rectangle on a screen. "I wasn't sure you'd actually answer," she admitted. "I almost didn't," I said. That broke the tension. Vanessa let out a nervous laugh, and before I realized it, I was smiling slightly too. We kept the conversation light, just as I had asked. Surface level. She told me about her job. She was training to become a licensed nail technician and was slowly building a small group of regular clients. She mentioned her children, Jaden, who was 8, and Lily, who was 6, but she never asked me to be their aunt. She respected the boundary without needing to be reminded. I told her about the business, about Seattle's constant rain, about the renovations happening on a few of our properties. Nothing too personal. At 14 minutes, I glanced at the clock. "We should probably wrap up," I said. Before I could end the call, Vanessa spoke. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance." "I know you didn't have to." I nodded. "This is step 1, I said. "We'll see where it goes." She smiled faintly. Step 1 is more than I expected. We scheduled another call for the following month. After she hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. I didn't know if Vanessa and I would ever have what people normally call a sister relationship. Maybe we would always stay in this careful space. But something important had changed. For the first time in my life, I was the one deciding what happened next. That power meant more to me than the inheritance. 1 year later, March 14th, 2026. Exactly 1 year since the will reading that changed everything. I stood outside a modest commercial building on Capitol Hill. It was the very first property Victor Stone had ever purchased back in 1987, when he was 34 years old, and barely had enough money for a down payment. The building had been renovated the previous fall. New windows, updated systems, fresh landscaping around the entrance. But the reason I was there that day had nothing to do with renovations. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. I ran my fingers across the engraved letters. Victor Stone Building. In memory of a man who chose love over blood, 1953 to 2025. The metal felt cool beneath my fingertips. Over the past year, Stone property holdings had continued to grow. The total value of the portfolio had increased by 12%, reaching $26.5 million. Occupancy rates stayed above 95% across all properties. We had expanded into 2 new buildings and completed major upgrades on 3 others. But the achievement that mattered most to me had nothing to do with real estate. The Victor Stone STEM Scholarship had awarded its first group of recipients, 5 students from difficult family backgrounds, 5 kids who now had full funding to attend summer science programs just like the one I had dreamed about when I was 13. Dr. Eleanor Price from Seattle Children's Hospital had helped select the recipients. Vanessa and I were still talking once a month. The calls had grown a little longer, from 15 minutes to 25. She had shown me photos of her kids. I had shown her pictures of my apartment and the office. We weren't sisters in the traditional sense, but we were something. Lydia and Calvin had stopped trying to contact me entirely. I didn't know what their lives looked like now, and I realized I didn't need to know. Elena walked up beside me and looked at the plaque. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about the question carefully. "I'm peaceful," I said. Elena smiled. "That's even better than happy." Victor had taught me something that took years to fully understand. Family is a choice. And for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. The sky over Seattle was clear that day for the first time in weeks. The mountains were visible in the distance. If I look at my own story through a psychological lens, there's a concept called conditional self-worth. It's the belief that you are only valuable if certain people approve of you. For the first 13 years of my life, I believed that. My mother's indifference felt like proof that I didn't matter. But what saved me wasn't Victor's money. It was his unconditional acceptance. He saw me for who I was, not for who someone else expected me to be. And that made all the difference. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's this. You don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth. And you have every right to set boundaries, even with family, even with parents, even with blood. Forgiveness is something you give yourself. Reconciliation is something you choose. Those are two very different things. And no one else gets to decide which one you offer. For a long time, I believed my worth depended on whether certain people chose me or not. Life eventually taught me a different lesson. Your value is never determined by the people who reject you. It's determined by how you rise, build your own life, and decide who truly deserves a place in it. Some relationships need to be forgiven so your heart can move forward, but forgiveness doesn't mean reopening doors that once caused you pain. If you were in my situation, what would you choose to do? Would you keep chasing approval from people who never truly saw you, or would you start building a life with those who genuinely respect your worth? I'd love to know where you're listening from right now, so leave a comment and tell me. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing this video. A simple action from you might help this story reach someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes one shared story at the right moment can change the way a person sees their own life.